and welcome. We're here back again with Catholic Conversations, and I'm sitting here this morning with Eric Hoyle from North Carolina, a mathematics tutor and prayed-home Catholic, and also an author of a very thorough study on confessional jurisdiction. You want to say a little bit about yourself, Eric, before we jump right into the questions about jurisdiction?
Sure. Thank you, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
Mm-hmm.
So I was raised a Protestant and came in college, got interested in religion because it occurred to me that either this was true and it was the most important thing in the world, or it was nonsense. So that led me eventually to the Catholic religion, which it's hard to say exactly when I converted because it's such a mess nowadays trying to figure out what you're supposed to believe and do. But in about 2004 was when I was with the Society of St. Pius X, and then became a Sedevacantist in 2005, and have been, reading a lot and trying to understand what's going on since then, and of course trying to practice the faith as best I can figure out how. That led me to, I read people saying things like, oh, you should read this dissertation by Maskevich about supply jurisdiction, and that explains why
Mm-hmm.
we, that explains why the traditionalist priest idea that basically whoever's ordained nowadays and is Catholic can operate a chapel. And so I read this dissertation by Maskevich, and I came to the opposite conclusion, that what he said, led me to believe that jurisdiction wasn't supplied. So that led me to, over the years, study more and read more, and eventually produce a study that, to me, it's kind of a research study. It's not just a quick article. So that first version of that came out in 2016, and I've recently updated it this year with quite a bit of new research.
Yeah, and we will provide links in the description with both the brief study and also the longer study that you have done, so
Oh,
that our viewers can look at this and really dive into it. So.
great.
So why did you write? Why did you do this study? I mean, it's not an article. It probably took you weeks upon weeks upon weeks, if not months, to do. Why did you do this?
Well, I guess I'm the kind of person that likes to dig into a project and just, once I decide that I want to figure something out, then I like to be thorough about it. Also, I found that
Mm-hmm.
as I found these different passages from different theologians, I thought to myself, people don't really know about this. Um, there are a lot of, I think that the way that the traditionalist sort of mind works is that there's certain thought leaders who write articles that are,
Mm-hmm.
just pretty straightforward and simple. And we can talk. I would like to talk about some of those today, like by Father Chicada, where he'll write a four-page
Yeah,
article,
absolutely.
and that four-page article will have some quotes from theologians that are like, 2 or 3 sentences long each, um, typically from Latin authors that most people can't look up, and and then he reaches a very firm conclusion, and people follow it. And I found that some of the scholarship of his and of other people's is just not trustworthy and not correct. So yeah, that kind
Yeah,
of spurred
and
me to continue studying because I would like to produce the documents to prove that we need to rethink a lot of these things.
right. Yeah,
So,
that's a great point. Go ahead.
let's talk about what jurisdiction is. Um, so jurisdiction is defined as the power to teach and govern, and it's a public power as opposed to a private power like the father of a family has authority in his family. But jurisdiction, ecclesiastical jurisdiction, is the power to govern the church. Um, it it exists either in the external forum or the internal forum, and the internal forum is mainly for the sacrament of confession, where the priest is judging a person's sins, and it can also be in the internal forum if outside of confession if the priest is, say, giving a dispensation. That's dealing with the moral obligations of that individual, not of the whole society. But jurisdiction is also in the external forum, which is typically exercised by the bishop, who governs the diocese, and he does all sorts of things that that have relevance to the whole community. Like, for example, he might found a church or establish a parish. He might send a priest to be the pastor at a certain place or to give a mission at a certain place. He might choose a person to be ordained and give the permission for that person to be ordained within the hierarchical structure of the church. So those kind of acts are acts of jurisdiction. The traditionalist movement, the people who resist Vatican II and want to have a chapel and a priest and a bishop, generally do not claim to have jurisdiction in the external forum. What they say is that they're just responding to an emergency and doing what they have to do to basically be able to practice the Catholic religion, which they think means they need the sacraments. They need to have the Mass, they need to have confession, Holy Communion, and of course matrimony, but and the sacrament of confirmation too. The thing is, not all of those are strictly necessary, but anyway, the so in the external forum, they sort of say we aren't claiming to govern, but the problem is that they're sort of forced to do things that imply the power to govern. And I think the most
Right.
obvious one is that they ordain priests and they set up churches, and they have public masses, and these sorts of things are not. You couldn't do these without jurisdiction in the external forum in the ordinary scheme of things. So and then of course in the internal forum they hear confessions, and the
Yeah.
church teaches. Yeah, the church teaches that requires jurisdiction. So, and this is a point where this is kind of the starting point of my whole study, because with jurisdiction in the internal forum, people can't say, oh well, it's an emergency, so that doesn't matter, which is what they say about a lot of things, and you can't really argue against that. It's sort of a judgment call, right? Is your judgment better or is my judgment better? Well, who knows, right? But when it comes to confession, the church teaches that it's, well, it's funny. One author says it's a dogmatic truth. Another author I saw said it's proximate to faith, which is one of these theological notes. It's
Okay.
not de fide, but it's basically something that is certain and you can't contest it. So
Right.
so the need for jurisdiction in the internal forum is something that everyone admits. The need for jurisdiction in order to validly absolve in confession. So just being a valid priest is not good enough. You need to have jurisdiction. So then the question is, well, how could it be? How could these priests have it? And the answer that they give is it's supplied. So for it to be supplied means that it wasn't granted in a normal way, right? Now the normal ways are for it to be ordinary or for it to be delegated. And if it's ordinary, that means that it is attached to an office. So if someone's a parish priest or if someone is a bishop, then they have ordinary jurisdiction over their territorial area, whether it be the diocese or the parish. So in other words, they don't have to be granted jurisdiction, they just have to be put into office. And when they're put into that office,
Okay.
the jurisdiction comes with it. So that's
Right.
ordinary jurisdiction. And then the other one is delegated jurisdiction, and that is when a prelate, either a bishop or the pope or somebody, whoever has the power to delegate his own ordinary jurisdiction, delegates it, which means grants it, grants the power to share in it, basically, or to exercise it in his name. Any jurisdiction it belongs to somebody. That's a key point to understand. Like, some people kind of have the idea that
Okay.
jurisdiction in general just belongs to the church, that is the church's jurisdiction, but it's actually a person who has it. Either the pope has it and that's his, or a bishop has it and that's his
Wow,
jurisdiction.
that's a really good point.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's a, like let me just say that's an eye opener because when you hear the word jurisdiction, it's a very formulaic type word, a very scientific type word. But what you're
mhm,
saying is yes, but it's a power that's given to a person,
exactly,
and
that's right.
it's retained by a person. It's not just some ethereal idea or concept out there that the church just
Exactly.
has as a quality or attribute. Okay.
Exactly, that's right. That's right. And I do think you're exactly right that that point does not get emphasized enough in the general discussion that goes on among
Hmm.
traditionalists, because people are talking about jurisdiction as, this thing that we need that basically, people like to use the phrase, the church supplies, ecclesia
Hmm.
suplet. And so it sounds like that it's just the church as a whole that's supplying. What the authors actually teach about that is that jurisdiction is supplied on account of law or custom, and it's the person who makes the law who is actually granting the jurisdiction, and it's his jurisdiction that's being used. So even in a case of jurisdiction that is granted by canon law, the way that I would understand it, which I'm pretty sure is correct, is that the Pope who made the canon law was delegating his own jurisdiction to whoever finds himself in a certain set of circumstances in the future. Um, so it's not delegated to a named individual, a specific individual, but it's delegated to all individuals who happen to come into a certain situation.
Okay.
But when they do exercise that jurisdiction, it's really the papal jurisdiction. Of course, that doesn't make them the Pope, doesn't give them a universal jurisdiction, but it's the Pope himself who gave his jurisdiction to people for a specific reason in a specific circumstance. For example, in
Okay.
danger of death. If the penitent is in danger of death, then any priest can absolve. So there's that key point that jurisdiction is always belonging to a person. Now, the delegated jurisdiction is received from someone who can delegate it. And the way that supplied jurisdiction is explained is that it's delegated by law, or law or custom, law or custom.
Okay.
So, and the Council of Trent defines that all jurisdictionary, well, it implies, but it's clear that all jurisdiction is either ordinary or delegated.
Okay.
So the explanation of supplied jurisdiction needs to be that it's delegated by law or custom. That's another kind of common misconception, is that supplied jurisdiction is this emergency thing that doesn't fit into any of the normal categories, that there's
Hmm.
like ordinary and delegated, and then there's supplied, which is a totally separate thing. But actually
Yeah.
it's delegated by. So yeah, so for confession, priests need to have jurisdiction for the internal forum, and so the way to get it is for it to be supplied. If they don't have it, if they can't claim it to be ordinary or delegated by a person, which is the situation nowadays for traditionalists, for at least for Sedevacantist,
Hmm.
it's very clear. So then they need it. They need it to be delegated by law. So what my study does is it goes into canon law, and it looks at the different arguments for why jurisdiction could be delegated by canon law,
Okay.
and examines those different arguments and finds all of them to be wanting in the particular case that we're
Now,
looking
the arguments for the traditionalist priests that they use to say, "Hey, we have delegated authority according to the law." That's what you're talking about.
at.
That are wanting. Their arguments are wanting.
Well, it's kind of like all the possible arguments are wanting. I think that
Okay.
they, I think that they appreciate. I'm not sure if they would admit that that's true, but I think that they more or less appreciate it, because what they'll say is if none of these arguments work, which they might, like some people will say that it could work, that common error could work, or positive and probable doubt of law or fact could work, or danger of death could work. Like it's actually quite a few people who are very bright and knowledgeable have said that everyone in the world nowadays is effectively in danger of death because we don't expect to have a confessor in the future. So, and then they quote some authors who do say that a situation where you'll never have a confessor can be set equal to danger of death. Now, that is, my understanding is that's a very minority opinion. Like, there are three authors who hold it, and but we can talk about that maybe later. But It's
Yeah.
not something that is clear and certain. It's a real
Okay.
stretch. It's a real stretch. I mean, it stretches the obvious meaning of danger of death. To think if
Right.
you're a very healthy person, you're young, you don't have any medical problems, you're not going into war, you're not in a war zone, you're not in danger of death.
It's a self-serving conclusion. I mean, it's a circular argument. It seems to me because the it's begging the question because the conclusion is really already implied within their premises that they're trying to put forth. If they're saying, okay, we're just a danger of death, like that's just it's a premise that hasn't been argued for, I think, properly because like you said, it's kind of a stretch of the original meaning. Like, yeah, I suppose in a more metaphysical sense, we're all in danger of death, aren't we? Or in a more eschatological sense, we're all in danger of death, aren't we? That's not what the lawgiver, intended. I think.
Mhm. Well, and I think that you're
But
exactly right to
we
bring.
can move on. I mean, that's a
Well, yeah, but the intention of the lawgiver is very important here, and you can tell from the text itself of the Council of Trent, which mentions this, and also the Code of Canon Law, that the whole purpose of this jurisdiction for confessions for somebody in danger of death is so that they'll have a chance to confess, if it might be their last confession. And so if you use
Mhm.
this argument day in and day out for months and years and say, we need confession on account of danger of death, well, but we're certain it's not going to be our last confession. I mean, we're almost certain. It, there's no reason to
Mhm.
think that we are getting this last confession so that we'll be able to die having confessed our sins. It's just not the case. But that's the whole point of jurisdiction, on account of danger of death, is to allow for a last
Yeah.
confession when otherwise it might be impossible.
Yeah.
So, but let me think. So, so there are these different arguments that come from canon law, and I think that, they're not very strong. I think none of them can succeed. And then what people will say after that is they'll say, well, if all the reasons that come from canon law are not correct, then we're just going to have to go with, um, the necessity knows no law argument, and the
Mm.
church is a loving mother, and she will provide all that's necessary for the good of souls. And so souls need confession, so the Holy Mother Church provides jurisdiction. And then they go on to say basically to literally any priest, at least who they believe is Catholic, in the whole world, for all people, which is, it's really a shocking type of thing compared to the way that the law worked, um,
Yeah.
in normal times. The only person who would have that type of jurisdiction is the Pope, um, in his own name, and then the cardinals also have confessional jurisdiction by law for the whole world. But besides that, there's nobody in the whole church before Vatican II who, in normal times, who could just hear anyone's confession anywhere, anytime. That's not how
Yeah.
it works. So
And
it's.
Eric, can we take a step back and key in on that?
Mhm.
So, why do you think that is that the church has these strict jurisdictional laws, set in stone in canon law, to like you were saying, like not a confessor had like a little territory, right,
Mhm.
in
Yes.
which he could hear confessions and absolve sins. So why is that? Why did the church have these, and she still does have these
Mhm.
laws?
Well, my answer to that now is different from what it would have been a couple of years ago. Um, it's an interesting
Okay.
thing. I think that the answer to that is that the church insists on being a hierarchical society. A non-hierarchical society where people can do what they want. It's not how the church has built herself. In fact, it's
Mm-hmm.
not how the constitution of the church is built. Um, the reason I say that is, it would be easy to say instead of that to say, well, the church is very cautious that everyone have a confessor who is competent. You know, like we have these
Mm-hmm.
laws to avoid incompetent priests, hearing confessions, to make sure that the church's authority has approved everyone who needs to hear confessions. That's what I would have said before. But nowadays, I really do think that it has
Okay.
more to do with a hierarchical society. The reason I say that is that the
Mm.
church, basically, like if a priest has committed a grave fault, a grave crime, and has become excommunicated, a priest can incur an automatic excommunication and still be a Catholic. Now, the authors say that you can incur an excommunication, and you're actually still a member of the church, and you still hold your office. And this was one of those things that just blew me out of
Okay.
the water when I first read it, when I was doing my research.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had read online people, traditionalists saying that, well, clearly an excommunicate's not a member of the church, and our traditionalist priests are in better state than an excommunicated person. Um, and I thought that made a lot of sense, right? But then I read the books, and it said that actually, when a person incurs an excommunication that's ipso facto, that's already stated in the law, that he loses the right to exercise his office, but he
Right.
retains the office itself. Um, and that's where you get one of these arguments from canon law about supply jurisdiction. It's canon 2261, which says that the faithful may approach an excommunicated minister for the sacraments um, for any just cause. And so, the thing is, for any just cause, the church allows you to go to a priest who is a criminal, a priest who clearly, right now, as of this very moment, is unworthy, is presumed to be in a state of sin. He doesn't absolutely have to be in a state of sin, but because we don't know that as far as the internal forum, but he's presumed to be.
Yeah.
That's what the books say. So the church would rather you confess to a criminal who is a Catholic holding an ecclesiastical office than to confess to a priest in good standing who doesn't have jurisdiction. What the authors say is that even in a state of grave need, um, the church does not supply jurisdiction to a person who doesn't have it to hear your confession. So I do think the reason why these jurisdictional laws exist, it's much more because the church is a hierarchy than because we want to find the most qualified or we want to make sure all our confessors are qualified.
Right.
That's a secondary consideration.
Hmm. Okay.
So,
We'll segue over then. Yeah. Thank you for that elaboration.
sure, you're welcome. I'm trying to think what else is worth talking about. So there are the 5 arguments that I deal with about how canon law might provide jurisdiction, and then the next thing to consider is they'll say, well, if all those arguments don't work, the traditionalists will say, well, then there's the church, necessity knows no law, Christ himself. Father Cicada, in his articles against the quote home aloners, said that Christ himself provides jurisdiction. Um, so, so they don't base their argument on canon law in the end. They have something deeper than that they think they can rely on.
Yeah. So, what about that argument?
Well, so that argument, the first thing I would say about it, the simplest way to deal with it is that what he's claiming is an extraordinary mission. He's claiming that people who were not sent by the church, who don't claim any ecclesiastical authority, they can't point to any prelate, any pope, any bishop who sent them to conduct a public ministry. They say, well, Christ gives us the right to do it. And what the books say is that if you claim an extraordinary mission, well, first of all, the authors will say that that's not possible in the New Covenant because we have the church and we have the ordinary mission.
Oh,
and
wow.
That's good enough.
Okay.
But like St. Francis de Sales says that. But they also say that if such a thing were to happen, an extraordinary mission, then whoever has one would need to prove it by miracles.
Mm-hmm.
And that means and that means that they would need to work miracles as they're doing their ministry. Like it wouldn't be just once in 10 years that they work a miracle. It would need to be like Moses had certain miracles that God gave him to prove his authority, where he could, what was it exactly? He threw his staff down and it became a snake, and then ate up the snakes of Pharaoh. And then, so he had, and I think there were some other things too that God gave him, like 2 or 3 different signs he could do that were miracles to prove that God sent him. And then our Lord, of course.
Well, one of the great miracles was him parting the Red Sea, right?
Yeah, but I mean things before he had ever taken leadership
Oh,
of the people of Israel.
Yeah.
To show that he was sent
Yeah.
to do that very thing. And so, and I think also our Lord referred to the miracles that he worked in order to prove his own mission. He said, if I get it right, he said, if you don't believe me, believe the miracles, or believe on account of the miracles. that, that he works. And also, when St. John the Baptist sent his disciples to our Lord said, well, look, the blind see, the deaf walk, the lepers are cleansed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that he was proving his own mission by the miracles. He wasn't trying to give some argument of why. He wasn't just arguing that he was sent because he needed to be sent. He was arguing he was sent because here it is. Here are the miracles. So yeah, so that's the number one problem with Father Chicata's thought of extraordinary mission of jurisdiction granted by Christ Himself. Um,
Yeah.
I would like to. So we've basically covered the ground now. There are 5 arguments from canon law that probably are too much to go into detail, but why people think that there could be supplied jurisdiction. None of them really work. There's danger of death we already talked about. There's common error.
Right.
Common error means that somebody is regarded as having either ordinary or delegated jurisdiction for one of the usual reasons, and actually he doesn't have it because of some hidden fault that people don't know about. So, for example, if there were a bishop who obtained his office by simony, right? If he paid money for his office, well, the church says that means he's invalidly appointed to that office. But if everybody thought he had the office and nobody knew that he had bought it, then he would be able to exercise jurisdiction because it would be supplied, and that would be because of common error. So that's another argument.
And that common error requires, though, that it be an occult fault, a secret fault that no one knows, or no one should know, or have a reason to know, right? Isn't that a requirement for common error?
Well, I think that what they say is that there's actually a controversy about that. Some authors even say that just if there's a cause that would lead people into error, that's good enough for common error. So, for example, if there's a church where a priest is sitting in a confessional, and he has his name on the sign above the confessional, and it's a church that belongs to a religious order, and he's got his name, and it says S.J. It looks like he's part of the order, and nobody would know if he doesn't have jurisdiction to hear confessions. And so if they show up and go to him for confession, then you could use common error as a reason why he would have supplied jurisdiction, because the evidence is there that would lead everybody to conclude that he's a confessor.
I see. Okay.
But the thing is that when the traditionalist priests and bishops, they say openly, we have no office, we have no authority in the external forum, we have no public authority. All we're doing is bringing the sacraments to people because they're needed. Well, that right there eliminates the possibility of a mistake of thinking that they do have authority or that they were delegated by somebody. So you can't have a common error about that. Anyway, so that's common error. And then there's another one of the reasons is positive or probable doubt of law or fact. So if you're not sure, or if the priest himself is not sure, but he has a good reason to think he has jurisdiction, then the church will supply it. The problem with that is nowadays we don't have that good reason to think that they have jurisdiction. So it doesn't work.
Okay.
Another one is urgent necessity. So if somebody, without being in danger of death, if somebody has an urgent need to receive the sacraments, for example, if they need to make their annual confession, which is required by law, 1 confession per year, or their Easter communion, and say this is the last opportunity to do that. Those are situations, of course, communion doesn't require jurisdiction, but those are the kind of things where the church would consider it an urgent need to receive the sacrament. Another one is confession before matrimony, that people are required to go to confession before matrimony, and if there's only one opportunity to do that, then it would be urgent. So that's urgent necessity. Now the problem with that is that canon law specifically says that in cases of urgent necessity, all confessors are obliged in charity to hear confessions. What that means is people who already have the jurisdiction are obliged to use it for the benefit of someone who is in urgent necessity, of a penitent in urgent necessity. And then the same canon says, a little later, it says, in danger of death, all priests are obliged in charity to hear confessions. And if you look up some of the the commentators on this, they say the same thing, that in urgent necessity, um, not all priests are obliged in charity to hear confessions. Well, why not? Because they don't have jurisdiction. Only confessors have jurisdiction.
Hmm.
So they're the ones who are
Only the
obliged in charity.
confessors do.
Yeah. So
So,
that's four of
and
the
just
five. Mhm. Go
and
ahead.
real quickly, so a confessor is a individual priest who is sent into a jurisdiction to hear confessions, or has a parish of his own, something along those lines. Is
Right.
that what a confessor is?
Right. A
Okay.
confessor is someone who either has ordinary or delegated jurisdiction to hear confessions.
Okay.
So if it's with their office, if it's a bishop or a parish priest, the pastor of a parish, then they would have ordinary jurisdiction to hear confessions, and then
Hmm.
typically an assistant priest would have delegated jurisdiction to hear confessions. So they would be a confessor. And by the way, one of the things I want to mention
Okay.
is it's normal for a priest, like if you become a Catholic priest, right, in the normal order of things, with a bishop who chose you and is going to they're going to send you into a ministry. So it's not normal for Catholic priests to not have confessional jurisdiction. That's one of the key things that they do to sanctify souls, is to hear confessions. So, our
Yeah.
situation, when you read the books, a lot of times I think the Catholic books sort of assume that when it's talking about a priest, the priest probably has confessional jurisdiction. And so sometimes you kind of have to read between the lines, where they're assuming a priest has jurisdiction even though they didn't say it. But certainly there are situations where a priest, in the normal course of events, wouldn't have jurisdiction. And the most obvious one is when he's
Hmm.
traveling, because jurisdiction is typically granted for a certain territory, physical, geographic territory. So if the priest is traveling, then he's not going to have jurisdiction over the people who live in that place. So,
Okay.
mhm. So the fifth
Unless in
article,
danger of death.
unless in danger of death, or unless he's a confessor on a
Right.
sea voyage. There's a canon law for that. So if he's traveling on a ship, and I think that the more modern authors have extended that to air travel also, in an airplane.
Okay.
Um, the So I tell you what, before we finish, I know we don't have all that much time. Um, I'd like to talk about this conversation could go on for a very long time, and I'm trying to think of what is the best to hit. I'd like to talk about this articles by Father Cicada, because
Yeah, I would too.
Mhm. Just within the last year or so, I came across a passage that really blew me away, um, that contradicted Father Cicada in one of his articles, where he's very brash and very certain that he's right. This article, the title of it is "Home Alone?" question mark by Father Cicada, um, and I want to read what he says here. So
Okay.
he quotes the Council of Trent, I'm going to read from the Council of Trent now. It says, "The Holy Synod teaches, furthermore, that those who by their own temerity take these offices upon themselves are not ministers of the Church, but are to be regarded as thieves and robbers who have not entered by the door." And then Canon 7, which kind of reiterates the same thing, it says, "If anyone says that those who have been neither rightly ordained nor sent by ecclesiastical and canonical authority, but come from a different source, are lawful ministers of the word and of the sacraments, let him be anathema."
Hmm.
All right? So, obviously, what it's saying is that being ordained rightly and being sent um, by ecclesiastical and canonical authority is required to be a lawful minister of the word and of the sacraments, um, which is what the priests who offer mass and give Holy Communion and hear confessions. That's what they're doing, being
Hmm.
ministers of the word and of the sacraments. So Father Jacata says, let's see here. He says that this is condemning lay ordination, meaning ordination. It's condemn. He says it's condemning Protestant ideas, um, like that the people could make someone a minister of the word and the sacraments, or
Uh-huh.
the state could make someone, like the queen or the prince, could make someone a priest. So he says it's condemning that, and that's true. It is condemning that. I agree, but um, Father Cicada says the home aloner misreads this as a condemnation of priests ordained without demissorial letters from a diocesan bishop, in other words, permission to be ordained, or some other thing. And anyway, so he quotes another part of where the Council of Trent condemned that. Let me see here. So, okay, so Father Shikata says that the Home Alone or translation is defective. Okay, so Father Shikata says that the correct translation of this passage is, if anyone says that orders conferred by bishops without the consent or call of the people, or of the secular power are invalid, or that those who have been neither ordained by ecclesiastical and canonical power with the proper ceremonies, nor sent, but come from elsewhere, are lawful ministers of the word and of the sacraments, let him be anathema. So what he's saying is that rightly ordained just means validly ordained. Okay? So I'm fine with that. And then the next part he says is that sent by ecclesiastical and canonical authority is a mistranslation.
Right.
So, he goes on and on about this, but I'm trying to find where he ever says it just in one clear sentence. Yeah, I mean, he skips by the main point. Like, I can't find one sentence that very clearly says it, but, so what he's saying is, this might be it. So, he's saying that authority, it's not about authority, it's about power. And it's talking about the sacramental power to ordain, okay? So he says it calls it ecclesiastical and canonical power. So what he's saying is that all this passage from Trent means is that people have to be ordained rightly, that they have to have a valid ceremony, Catholic holy orders, where it's conferred properly by a bishop and it's valid, right? He says that's what this whole passage is, nothing else, okay?
Okay.
So that's the key point. That's the key point. That's what he's saying. Now, what I found this passage by Giovanni Soglia, a cardinal, writing in, I think he was, what the date was. I think he was writing either in the late 19th century or early 20th century, before the Code of Canon Law. But listen to what he says. He's speaking about the very same passage from Trent. He says, this power of jurisdiction is conferred by the assignment of subjects, or by legitimate deputation to exercise a spiritual duty, without which deputation acts of jurisdiction are null, both in the internal and the external fora. On this matter, the Council of Trent defined, quote, if anyone shall say, those are legitimate ministers of the word and the sacraments, who by ecclesiastical and canonical power are neither rightly ordained nor sent, let him be anathema. And then that's the end of the quote. Now, Soglia continues, he explains it. He says, thus, two things are required, both order and legitimate mission, of which the first is obtained by holy ordination, the other by the legitimate assignment of subjects.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a cardinal writing in about the same time as Trent, you said? A little bit after?
He was writing, let me look it up, I might have the date. This was published in 1853. Yeah, 1853.
That's really interesting. Another interesting thing about the passage that you're in the article, I think from which we actually get Home Alone, is that Cicada within that article attempts to translate his own English from the Latin, and there's actually an anathema attached to anyone who would dare translate into their own language and the anything from the Council of Trent. I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well,
there's actually an anathema attached to that.
Yeah. So at the end of the council, the Pope made a decree saying that no priest or layperson was permitted to interpret the Council of Trent privately, and he actually he established a Roman congregation to be for the interpretation of Trent, and that existed for centuries. The congregation of the council. So Yeah, I don't think that it means we can't talk about it and you know, have a discussion about what it means. I
Right.
think,
But
I
he
think
he
that,
publicly translated it in his own way, right? It's a different
well,
translation than the Denzinger.
yeah, I think there's room though to translate different ways. Translations are never just, usually translations are not just the absolute right translation. You can phrase it different ways. So I don't think that he necessarily did anything wrong with that, especially in our situation nowadays where we're
Okay.
trying to handle things without ecclesiastical authority to guide us. You know, um, if we couldn't make our own interpretations and do our own research, then you know we wouldn't be able to say, okay, instead of that, I'm going to just follow authority. Because we don't have that living authority to follow, at least not that we recognize as being our legitimate pastors. So,
Yeah, so maybe
so
the
we're sort
idea
of
of
forced.
epikeia or yeah.
Yeah, well, we're forced to try to
Um,
figure it out for ourselves the best we can. And also, I think that the mind of the church is to encourage everyone, lay people, everyone, to become more educated, to read more things, to read the Bible. That Pius XII encouraged that, Leo XIII encouraged that. So it's sort of a relic of times when there was a fierce fight against Protestantism. This idea that lay people
mhm.
shouldn't go into that kind of thing. I think it's not really the mind of the church nowadays. In fact, I think there are encyclicals that say that ignorance is a great problem, is something that we need to fight against, and the way to fight against ignorance is to become educated. So the church is very much in favor of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking about getting educated, I would recommend your study, your brief study, to all of our viewers, and for those who are really just hungry for getting into these issues and the nitty gritty, your longer study. Could you briefly say a word or two about your longer study and what that treats, and why some of our viewers might be interested in delving into that?
Sure. Well, so the shorter version is like 20 pages, and what it does is just cover
Hmm.
the main points and doesn't really deal with objections. It just says, okay, here are my points and the end. Um, the long version is 230 pages, so far longer, 10 times as long. Um, what it does is first it begins with some lengthy quotations that explain what jurisdiction is. And I think that that is very important for people to understand. There are a lot of things that you might find in the books that
Hmm.
you just didn't expect to find. That's been my experience over the years. Um, I might, there are things that you just find in the books that everybody knows who's a Catholic scholar from old times that surprise me. I've mentioned a couple of those today, I think, on
Yeah.
just now. And so you really do need to read for yourself what the church says about jurisdiction if you want to think about it and study it and talk about it. But then, so after
Hmm.
that introductory part about what is jurisdiction, then it includes the same 20 pages essentially um, from the short version that are the main argument about canon
Okay.
law, and then about why the arguments for why you can't rely on some jurisdiction granted by the church itself or by Christ himself, things like that. And then the remainder, the dozens of more pages, those deal with objections. Like, so there's a long section about danger of death, um, whether you could, what do you call it, whether you could broaden the meaning of danger of death. People quote St.
Hmm.
Alphonsus Liguori about that. Um, and so I went into a lot about that. Let me just look at the table of contents. Yeah, so broader meaning of danger of death, and then epikeia. I talked about the epikeia some. There's a good source on
Highly
epikeia.
misunderstood idea.
Hmm. Yeah, the fascinating thing about epikeia, most people don't
Hmm.
understand what it actually is. Epikeia is when there's a law, it applies to the case that you're in right now, and the authority of the church has the right to require obedience. Okay, all three of those things have to occur. So there's a law that applies to your case, and the church has the power to require obedience. Um, but for Epikeia, what you say is, but the lawgiver would not want to do that. if he were here and we could ask him, he would not want to require obedience, even though he could. It wouldn't be like a sin on his part or impossible on his part to require obedience. And then the other part is that you have to have a situation where you aren't able to ask him. You aren't able to have to recur to the superior, because if you could ask him, you should do that instead of just breaking the law and saying, well, he wouldn't want me to follow the law right now. So those for all those circumstances to come together where epikeia applies, it's not easy. It's not that simple. Now the other thing that can happen though is called intrinsic cessation of law, and this is really what people should argue.
Okay.
The ones who like to talk about epikeia, what they should be talking about is cessation of law, which means that if a law can't be observed for some physical or moral reason, then you don't have to observe it, period. And that's the kind of thing like the Sunday Mass obligation. If there's a dying person who you need to attend right now, and that means you can't go to Mass, then you can't go to Mass. And it's not because of epikeia, it's because of cessation of law. That law just isn't binding in that case, because it
no longer binds in the case of necessity.
Yeah, another one that's in Riley's book that's really fascinating. He says that if a man were to overhear his wife's confession, and based on what he overhears, he realizes that his marriage to her is invalid, what does he do? And it's a very interesting question, because his choices are to break the seal of confession, which would be against divine law, or to live with his person who thinks she's his wife, who isn't, as if they were husband and wife, which is against the natural law. So, it's one of these catch-22s, and so the authors give different give different solutions, but whatever the solution is, one of those laws has to give way to the other. So it's a situation where there's a cessation of either, divine law or natural law. Yeah, so it's pretty wild. But anyway, so I dealt with that as far as
that sounds
relating to
interesting.
jurisdiction. Yeah, Riley's book is really fascinating. And then there's an objection about the rights and obligations to receive the sacraments, whether that would cause jurisdiction to be supplied. The Great Western Schism, a lot of people like to say, well, in the Great Western Schism, there were priests who were under an antipope, and they still had jurisdiction, so why not nowadays? So I dealt with that. The fact that Eastern schismatics can absolve valid.
That's another topic that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Eastern schismatics are able to absolve validly. So why, in certain cases? So why not traditionalists? That's another objection. Another one is that bishops were consecrated during the papal interregnum in the 1200s, I believe it was. So that's not so relevant to jurisdiction, but it is relevant to the whole traditionalist concept. Then I have a response to Father Cicada's article. He had another longer article about jurisdiction called "Traditional Priests' Legitimate Sacraments," and that's the article in which he develops this idea that the jurisdiction comes from Christ himself. So I had a response.
Right. Okay. And you wrote a response to that within your longer study. Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the longer study, it tries to handle all the different objections. That's something else that's worth talking about too. That's pretty much the end of it, of the key objections that I answered. And then so the last I don't know, 50 pages or 80 pages are just quotations from different authors that I think people should see. So really the part that is me giving my arguments is only 145 pages, and the rest after that is quotations.
Okay. Wow. All right. So very, very researched. Yeah. So so Eric, before we close here, I'd like to look back where we've come. We've discussed jurisdiction, and we've talked about how it applies and what it is and who has it and who doesn't. Can you just give us some kind of like a summary statement of why is it so important? Like, why are we even talking about this as apocalyptic Catholics, as it were? Why are we talking about this right now? Why is it so important?
Well, it's important because the Catholic Church is a hierarchical entity by its constitution. It consists of the Pope and the bishops in union with him and the laity, and the rest of the clergy as well. And if to adopt a line of action, whether it's our line of belief or not, but to adopt a line of action that basically leads to the church being a patchwork of independent operations that do their own thing. You know, my opinion is that this is profoundly out of step with the constitution of the church, and I think that's why it's very, very important. I think that this crisis has lasted so long, decades now. I think that people who were getting started in the 70s just trying to preserve the faith and they wanted to preserve the sacraments for themselves, I think that their line of action was very short-sighted and had this idea that, oh, well, God's going to solve the problem someday. We don't need to take certain steps that might be too controversial or something, But what ended up happening was they said, well, gee, we can just drop the idea of having a hierarchical church and let God take care of that. And so that's the one reason that I think it's very important. Now, the other practical reason, of course, is that confession is invalid without jurisdiction. So, people who may be making invalid confessions might like to know that and consider that. I would say, though, just in case that shocks anyone or terrifies anyone, that it's a theological opinion that if a person goes to Holy Communion with attrition, meaning the type of sorrow for sin that you need to be absolved validly in confession, that if you think that you're in a state of grace and you're actually in a state of sin, and you go to Holy Communion, and you do have that sorrow for sin, which would be sufficient to be forgiven in the sacrament of confession, that the authors believe that Holy Communion itself would restore you to the state of grace. So what that means is that if you are actually confessing invalidly and you go to Holy Communion with what you think are the proper dispositions, what should be the proper dispositions, if your confession had been valid, then you should actually not be committing a sacrilege, but you should be put in the state of grace. So I don't think that the people who are attending the traditionalist chapels are necessarily being, spiritually destroyed by the invalidity of confession. But I do think it's invalid. I mean, over the years, I've had this position for 6 years now, and I keep thinking to myself, I would really rather be proved wrong. But the more I think about it and study it, I just think it's true. So
Yeah.
so those are the two reasons that the jurisdiction thing matters, for the validity of confession and for the hierarchical nature of the church.
Well, Eric Hoyle, I appreciate you coming on to Catholic Conversations and explaining this very dense matter to us in a very easy and digestible way. And maybe look forward to you coming on again, and maybe we could tackle that Father Cicada longer study you were talking about that he did, and then
Sure.
you had objections to. That might be an interesting thing.
Yeah, it is.
But
interesting.
do you have anything? Do you have anything else that you might like to add before we close? You think it's pretty much
Well,
summed it all up?
I would say that we all need to keep our courage up and keep our trust in God, because He has foreseen this for all eternity, and He knows how to bring good out of evil. And this explosion of evil, I think, will lead to an explosion of good, however that may be. Our Lord may return and set everything right, not on this earth, but in the new heaven and the new earth, which is what I expect, frankly, to come out of this, is that this problem's probably not going to get fixed. And I think we need to live our lives with courage and confidence, knowing that we place ourselves in the hands of divine providence.
That's a beautiful sentiment and a beautiful thing to live by, and we are a people of hope, aren't we? So let's live out our Catholic faith and courage, like you were saying. All right, Eric Hoyle. Well, it was a pleasure, and I really appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to having more episodes with you on